So words hurt, but they also can tell us a story. And so when I think about the word Karen or the word Becky, I think about something that has now become more than just white women. You know, it's often used to describe white men as a way to describe kind of like this obnoxious, racist kind of person in the suburbs who thinks that they can stick their nose into everyone's business and are just completely unaware of their own bias. And they're nosy and they're officious and they are just kind of a general asshole, right? But when we think about that, we're thinking about the fact that it's interesting that in the whole story, in the United States story, it's been predominantly white men who have held the power and who have constructed this racist, sexist, classist country. You know, this is white men who have really done the most damage. And yet it's interesting that who we're coming for first, right? Who's our person that we're going to stick it to first is not John or not Steve, right? And so language matters, and who we're coming for first as kind of a cultural narrative also matters. And so this might be triggering to some, and I just want to emphasize that this is just my analogy. I'm using a story, and the story that I'm using about the Karen and the Beckys are that, you know, we want to address systemic racism and we want to address things that are unjust about our society. And one, I just want to say, namely, people don't learn from shame. They will shut down and they will further isolate. So people don't learn from shame regardless. You can't shame people into learning or changing. That's just my personal perspective. But in this analogy that I want to use, this story, it's the slave class, right, is rising up on the plantation model, right, in the plantation economic model, and they're rising up from the slave quarters. We're kind of at that pivotal point in human history from the 1960s until now with Black Lives Matter. And they're headed for that plantation house, right, to demand justice, right? And they deserve justice, right? They have righteous indignation and, you know, 500 years of, if you consider Native American history of genocide. And so they have righteous indignation and anger and trauma that needs to be, to seek justice, right? So they reach the plantation house, right? But it's almost like the white male slave owner has sent his wife to the door to answer the door, if you will, if you could just imagine her for a moment. And if we can just step into a place of mercy for a moment, instead of kind of like this automatic anger, because we're in that angry mode as we're getting to the front door and we're meeting whoever's, you know, opening that door. But the slave owner's wife, right, she was sold to her husband probably when she was like 16 in an economic arrangement with her father and her husband, right? And her father abused her. And she's been very victimized. And then she's in this relationship with this husband, right? And in that white male power structure, you know, she can't own property, you know, and she's, you know, maybe raped nightly. She's physically and emotionally abused in this scenario. So she doesn't recognize having any significant historical power. It's like coming to her and saying, you know, you're responsible for this lengthy history of land ownership and for this economic system and so forth. And she's like, what are you talking about? I have no economic rights. I have no money of my own, etc. So one thing I want to point out is, you know, the white male power system is fine with the white woman being the one to answer the door. It's fine with white women being the one held accountable for white culture, if you will. But white culture, and I describe that as WHITE. White culture for me is different than white women culture, which I spelled WHYTE, because white women have a hard time, I think, taking accountability or taking responsibility for things like racism in the United States. Because they really haven't seen themselves as having power, like not until, you know, recent, maybe the last, like I said, up until the 1990s, they could be raped by their husbands legally. So, and demographically, they're only making 3% of CEOs in the United States. So when we come for them and we say we want these white women to be held accountable, these Karens, one, I don't believe they're going to be learning from shame. Two, I think it's significant that we haven't had a term that has so much cultural adoption as the Karen term, as far as having a white male equivalent. And now we're also looking at white women that aren't able to own a sense of responsibility or accountability, because in my perception, they're not seeing themselves as having had that much power for very long, right? Up until the 1950s and 60s, they were primarily homemakers and didn't have the ability to leave their husbands financially. And so to get people's buy-in, and to get them to really create systemic change, you need to get white women to challenge the white male power structure, right? And there is such blind obedience to that white male power structure of giving white men preference, giving white men the opportunity to talk over them, giving white men power in their relationships, giving white men power in the workforce, not holding them accountable in the same way, because we are lumping them together. And so white women are thinking that their only opportunity for kind of survival is to stick with these white men, right? And not to, shit where you eat, if you will. But really what we need to do is really help white women understand that the white male power structure, part of that is everyday interactions with white men. And I've seen this in meetings where white women won't call out white men that are being that are mansplaining or that are being dominant. They'll let white men speak longer. If you look at statistical analysis, white men will speak the most in any kind of like group setting. And so it's really helping these white women understand, not that white men are evil per se, but that white male power structure is inherent. It's a privilege that white men have in this country, and that it doesn't serve them to support that. So let's look at where white women are in politics. And I really want to make a huge distinction between white women and Jewish women. Jewish women are their own ethnicity and cultural group. And so because we often whitewash Jewish women's advances and their unique struggles, we end up attributing advances for liberal white women that really belong to another ethnic and cultural group. Because sometimes I'll research and I'll see 5 women that appear to be white, right, who've come up in politics and who've come up in business or something like that, like Ginsburg, for example. And our culture will adopt that as a leap forward for white women or for liberal white women in politics. And what they don't understand is that as far as that waspy, kind of typical hetero white woman liberal, you just don't see her out there in the same way that you might see other demographics. And part of that, I think, is that we are still protecting that white woman on the plantation. We're still keeping her in the house. So I also like to look for where are the white female rock stars in the American political frontier. So I see AOC and I see Nina Turner from Ohio. And I don't care if you're liberal or conservative, but these women, and you see young white women in the Republican movement as well. These women are hip and they're cool and they're smart and they're sassy and they're speaking their truth, and they've got flair, right? They've got fashion. They're cultural icons, and they speak to a younger demographic, right? But when I look out with my, eyes of analysis on the political scene, I don't really see in the United States any young liberal white female rock stars, right? Pelosi is not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about someone like MLK Jr. or Malcolm X that really like stirs up the populace and gets us thinking and gets us excited. And I think that there's a reason, right, that we don't see with the number of white women in this country, as far as the number of white women voters, it's very significant that we don't see a liberal white female rock star in the American political frontier. And so I always wonder, what does it mean when these kind of people are missing, right? You have a huge demographic of white women in the United States. Why don't you have any white female rock stars out there in the political kind of frontier? And I would posit, and I'm open to other people's perspective, but is it because kind of culturally we're still protecting the white woman in the plantation house, right? That if you're calling the shots, right, you're not in that place of being protected. And kind of that leads to the idea of the female villain. When I had watched the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial, I struggled because I saw a lot of people just culturally struggling with the idea of a woman who's young and white and pretty being a villain. That somehow, I think when we talk about like sexual abuse, we talk a lot about male sexual abuse of women, or fathers and uncles abusing women, but we don't talk about negligent mothers as much in our society, as far as like white mothers that are negligent, white mothers that are abusive. And I think we're really deeply uncomfortable as a society in dealing with that white female villain, right? And really seeing her as being someone who's evil, or who has done bad, or who is capable of doing bad. And just like anything, if you have power, you can use power for good or for evil. But there's something that happens when we just don't let people have the power to kind of risk being the villain, right? And Martha Stewart is a really good example of this, because, you know, our culture was very quick to kind of like, I don't know, excuse her insider trading, and kind of, we wanted to redeem her in some ways and like protect her. And then we wanted to get her out there like selling sheets again, right? So we don't want to, it's just, we don't want to demonize the white woman villain too much in our society. We want to kind of scoot her along to being redeemed. And I don't think that helps any of us. I think that just like there are white women that are, you know, good and doing good things, there are white women that are bad and doing bad things, right? One question I like to ask myself in leading in the political movement is, where are we supportive of white women in leadership positions, right? Because I see a lot of things happen, like in the United Kingdom, there was the prime minister, I forget her name, she was a white woman, and she was a conservative, and she was taken out of power this past year. But the way she was taken out of power was very fascinating to me. She wasn't allowed to talk to the public. It was all kind of handled by these men that had seniority or had been in politics longer. And they kind of like scuttled her off the stage, you know? And so they really just kind of decided her political future. And the way she was handled was almost like she was like a child, right? And so I think one thing my astrologer says is that women have not held power for thousands of years in the Western culture. And she says they may come awkwardly into power, right? And being awkward with power means that, you know, you might fumble that ball, right? You might make awkward statements, you know, you might not have been accustomed to public speaking. And so I don't think as a culture we're very forgiving or kind or supportive to women that white women that are coming awkwardly into power, if you will. I think our expectations are that they are superhuman, they're perfect, that they don't have libidos, you know, they're here to make everyone happy, and that they're pawns for men in power. I would say predominantly white men. And I also think it's important to note that white women are in a position where I think they fall into those traps quite easily, you know. You can have a man in politics that can have an affair and somehow it's brushed under the rug. But I think for women who are in leadership positions to have affairs is considered like a huge blemish on their career, like if they had an affair with their secretary or something like that. So in terms of the double standards, you know, seeing women as kind of these sexless, superhuman pawns that are here to make everyone happy doesn't really help them. So I spend a lot of time watching conservative news because I'm trying to lead a political movement, and I care a great deal about how others think and how all demographics are thinking. And when I'm watching the conservative news stations, as far as like seeing young and vibrant Republican white women, I'm seeing them up there on the stages, right, commanding the microphone, and they're fighting, they're fiery. And when I say they may be upholding the slave master's message, what I'm saying is they could be arguing for a policy that doesn't really serve their gender. But if I'm looking for power and I'm looking for role models and I'm seeing white women that are able to be angry and in the limelight, then I too can see like what that appeal is, which is like, wow, I get to get up there, and it's not just like old Nancy Pelosi that gets to like, you know, do insider trading and everyone looks the other way. Like I get to actually get up there and be young and not in my 70s and really speak about my anger. And these women have anger, right? So they may be channeling that anger in a way that is misdirected or in a way that is actually being utilized because they're pawns, right? That's up for debate. But either way, there's that visual, and we live in a very visual society. Maybe at some point we will be less focused on optics. But at this point in our society, we're very focused on image, right? And so we all need to see people that look like us, who sound like us, who come from similar circumstances, so that we can imagine ourselves, you know, breaking glass ceilings. So the image of a queen, right? You'll see a lot of times Black women will talk about being a queen, right? And for me, being a queen